It was raining hard. Sheets of rain pounded against the nylon fabric of my tent, drumming in relentless rhythm. The wind roared through the trees, its angry howl a chilling sound that cut through the night like a blade. Each gust made the towering evergreens surrounding my campsite groan and sway, their limbs creaking ominously. It was the kind of storm that didn't just sweep through. It felt alive, a monstrous thing that wanted to uproot the world itself. I was crouched inside my tent, struggling to change into my rain gear. My hands fumbled with the slick material, and my heart thudded heavily in my chest. The air inside the tent felt tight, pressing in around me like a cold fist. Each boom of thunder seemed closer than the last, a bone-rattling force that made my teeth chatter. I tried to steady my breath, focusing on each task, slip one arm into the sleeve, zip up the jacket, adjust the hood. But the unease I'd felt all day had swelled into full-blown anxiety. Something about the storm felt wrong, unnatural, as though the forest itself was trying to warn me to run. Every time a gust of wind battered the tent walls, my pulse spiked. I told myself it was just a storm, albeit a fierce one. I'd weathered worse. I tried to shake off the feeling that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the reach of my flashlight. Then there was a cracking sound, an ear-splitting, bone-snapping crack that cut through the roar of the storm. It felt like the earth itself had split open. I froze, heart stalling in my chest, as a deep groan echoed through the woods. The sound was primal, a wooden scream that made my blood run cold. I didn't have time to think, to react, before the world came crashing down around me. I was halfway out of the tent when it happened. My hands were outstretched, and I was bracing myself to push into the downpour. In an instant, the air seemed to shatter. A monstrous force slammed into the tent, a massive weight that crumpled the flimsy structure like tissue paper. It was a tree, a full-on tree, its trunk easily 14 inches in diameter. I had no time to scream, no time to even draw breath. The impact hurled me forward, a brutal shove that catapulted me out of the tent and into the cold, muddy dirt. The world spun. I felt the wet ground collide with my side, knocking the wind out of me. Mud smeared across my face, clinging to my skin and stinging my eyes. Pain bloomed in my ribs, a sharp, fiery ache that made my vision blur. But the overwhelming sensation was confusion, disorientation. The rain pelted down in icy needles, blinding me. For a few seconds, I couldn't move. I lay there in the mud, gasping for air, feeling the rain soak through my clothes. Then I heard it, a sound that sent a spear of pure terror down my spine. A creak, a low groan, as if the forest itself was breathing, shifting. My heart hammered, and I forced myself to move. I clawed at the dirt, dragging myself away from the wreckage of my tent. The tree lay across the mangled remains, its branches splintered and broken, but something else was moving in the darkness. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it, a presence, something massive and suffocating, lurking just beyond the downpour. I stumbled to my feet, every nerve screaming. The storm seemed to close in tighter, pressing against me. My flashlight lay in the mud, its beam flickering erratically, barely piercing the curtain of rain. I grabbed it with shaking hands, aiming the light into the darkness, but it caught only shadows and flashes of wet bark. The forest was alive with sound, branches crashing and leaves whispering like voices. Was it just the storm, or was something watching me, waiting? Another creak, louder this time. My breath hitched. The sound came from deeper in the woods, where the trees seemed to huddle together in a wall of blackness. I strained to listen, but the wind snatched away any clues. My mind raced with wild thoughts. Another tree ready to fall, something crashing through the underbrush. But there was a different feeling that chilled me to my core. The sense that whatever had just happened wasn't random. That tree hadn't fallen on its own. The rain blurred the world around me, but my fear was razor sharp. My soaked clothes clung to my skin, and I felt exposed, vulnerable, as if 1,000 eyes were fixed on me from the shadows. I backed away from the fallen tree, each step an effort. The mud sucked at my boots, the wind slapped against me, but I couldn't stop moving. Every instinct screamed at me to get away, to find somewhere safe. But where was safe? The storm had turned the forest into a labyrinth of terror, a place where the natural world was no longer predictable. The thought twisted my gut. What if the forest didn't want me here? What if it had conspired with the storm, with something else, to drive me out or trap me? Another crash, this one closer. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and I nearly dropped the flashlight. I swung the beam around, desperate, and for a split second, I thought I saw something, an enormous shape moving between the trees. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, but the fear that took hold of me felt like claws raking down my back. Panic surged. I stumbled further away from the wreckage of my tent, my breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. The storm swallowed my sobs, leaving me alone, a small, terrified figure in the heart of an enraged wilderness. I ran, not knowing where I was going, driven only by the primal urge to escape whatever hunted me in that rain-soaked nightmare. The late summer sun was dipping below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery streaks of red and orange as my fiancée and I stood by our grill, the air thick with the scent of sizzling meat and pine. Arkansas's wilderness was breathtaking, dense with ancient trees that loomed like silent guardians, their shadows stretching long and dark as the light waned. We were laughing about something trivial, the carefree sounds of our voices echoing into the woods. For a moment, life felt simple, perfect, but that serenity shattered in an instant, replaced by a sound that still haunts me to this day. Help! The scream cut through the evening air, raw and jagged, like a desperate animal cry. It wasn't just loud, it was soaked in a terror that made my blood run cold. My heart stopped, then lurched into a sprint, pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I glanced at my fiancée, wide-eyed, our smiles erased, replaced with a mutual understanding that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong. Without a word, I took off, legs pumping through the underbrush, the fading laughter and warmth of our campsite swallowed by the encroaching shadows. I followed the sound, stumbling over rocks and roots, my breath catching in my throat. The cries grew louder, more desperate, as I rounded a corner and came to a halt. The scene that unfolded before me was like something ripped straight out of a nightmare. A man stood in the center of a neighboring campsite, his body swaying, face pale and eyes glassy. Blood pooled around his feet, dark and glistening, spreading like a crimson lake across the forest floor. He was clutching his leg, where a gash in his ankle gushed a torrent of blood with every frantic heartbeat. The sight was grotesque, unreal, as if the forest had swallowed him and was now spitting him back out, broken and bleeding. I stumbled, nausea rising in my gut, but I forced myself forward. He was drunk, stumbling, muttering nonsense, his words slurred and barely coherent. But the fear in his eyes was unmistakable, wide and wild. "Please," he managed to croak, his voice cracking, the sound cutting straight through my chest. I had never seen so much blood. It coated his leg in a gruesome slick, streaming over his foot, soaking into the earth. I couldn't look away, my limbs frozen with horror. Then my fiancée was there, calm in a way that I could never be. She dropped to her knees, hands steady, and began to work on the wound. She wrapped it as best she could with whatever fabric she could find, trying to slow the gushing flow, her fingers slick with his blood. The man was fading fast, swaying even more, and I could feel panic clawing up my throat. "I need to call for help," I gasped, stumbling back toward our campsite. My legs felt like jelly, the world spinning around me as I raced through the trees. I burst into our tent and grabbed my phone, my hands trembling so badly I nearly dropped it. I fumbled with the screen, my heart hammering as I waited for bars to appear. Just one, anything. But there was nothing. The screen mocked me with its "no service" message, and I cursed, bile rising in my throat. Panic threatened to consume me, but adrenaline kicked in, forcing me into action. I had no choice. "There's a hospital 20 miles away," I told my fiancée, who was still kneeling beside the man, her face a mask of controlled fear. The man was slipping in and out of consciousness now, his head lolling. We had to move. Now. I helped haul him to his feet, though he was more dead weight than anything else. We half carried, half dragged him to his battered old truck. Blood smeared across my hands and shirt, the warmth of it sickening, but I couldn't think about that now. We loaded him into the passenger seat, and I climbed behind the wheel. The interior reeked of booze and coppery blood, and I swallowed hard, fighting the urge to gag. I drove like a madwoman, my hands clenched around the steering wheel, knuckles white. The winding forest roads were slick with mist and shadows, and the truck's headlights barely pierced the encroaching darkness. Blood makes me queasy, and every time I glanced at the man beside me, I felt my stomach twist. He was fading fast, his breathing ragged, and I could see the blood pooling around his feet, seeping into the floor mat in a sickening red puddle. I forced myself to focus on the road, but I was terrified I'd pass out before we even made it. 12 minutes, I muttered under my breath like a prayer, pressing harder on the gas. Branches loomed over us, forming a tunnel that seemed to stretch forever. Every bump in the road jolted my nerves. Every shadow felt like a monstrous hand reaching out. His speech slurred more and more, each word slower than the last, and I realized how close he was to losing consciousness, or worse. When we finally screeched to a halt at the hospital entrance, I barely remember getting out of the truck. The world was a blur of red and white, blood and fluorescent lights, as the staff rushed out to drag him inside. The door opened, and I watched, dazed, as blood spilled from the floor mat, a macabre waterfall splattering onto the pavement. The last thing I saw was the man being wheeled away, limp and pale, before I collapsed onto a bench, my entire body trembling. My fiancée picked me up sometime later. The forest felt different on our way back, heavier, as if the shadows were deeper, the trees whispering about the life we had almost lost. We ended up dog-sitting for the man, trying to salvage what was left of our evening, but the horror lingered, thick and suffocating. At 10:30 p.m., he showed back up at our campsite, stitches lining his ankle like a gruesome zipper. The doctor had told him, matter-of-factly, that if we hadn't acted when we did, he would have bled out. The thought was a cold, haunting weight in my chest. We had saved a life, but the forest seemed darker that night, the shadows watching, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, some dark, hungry force, had been waiting for a life to slip away. We went camping up at Rock Island, Wisconsin over the summer. For those who don't know, Rock Island is about as remote as it gets. You have to take a ferry from Door County to Washington Island, and then a second boat to Rock Island itself. The island is totally primitive, no roads, no vehicles, no electricity. Just wild forest, rugged shoreline, and an unsettling silence that clings to the place like a memory. The island is soaked in history, too. There are 3 separate cemeteries scattered throughout the woods, and the skeletal remains of buildings left behind by early settlers, their stories swallowed by time. The day had been warm and bright, but as the sun dipped below the horizon, the island transformed. The temperature plummeted, and a shiver crawled up my spine, more from the atmosphere than the chill. The sky had cleared completely, and the stars were out in full force, millions of them glittering like shards of ice. It was too perfect a night to waste in the tent. My husband and I decided to go stargazing at a field about a quarter-mile from our campsite. The walk there wasn't supposed to be anything special, but Rock Island had a way of making the mundane feel like something out of a ghost story. The path to the field wove through dense trees, where the moonlight barely penetrated. Shadows tangled between the trunks, shifting and stretching as our flashlight beams swept over them. And then, of course, we had to pass by one of the old cemeteries. We didn't talk much as we approached it, the only sounds the crunch of gravel underfoot and the whisper of leaves stirred by the cool breeze. The cemetery came into view, a small clearing with a wrought iron fence half swallowed by moss and ivy. Gravestones jutted out of the ground at crooked angles, some so worn they were nearly unreadable. A sense of unease settled over me, heavy and suffocating. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself it was just an old burial ground, just the product of a long-forgotten past. But something about it felt wrong, like the island itself was holding its breath. We picked up our pace, eager to put the graves behind us, when the fog began to roll in. It came out of nowhere, thick and swirling, seeping through the trees like ghostly tendrils. Within minutes, it swallowed the moonlight, turning the woods into a place of shadows and whispers. I glanced at my husband, who gave me a reassuring smile, but I could see the unease in his eyes too. The air felt different now, colder, pressing against my skin with a clammy weight. Still, we pressed on, telling ourselves it was just a bit of fog, nothing unusual. But then I saw them, a pair of glowing eyes, low to the ground and unblinking, staring straight at us from the darkness. My breath caught in my throat, and a spike of icy fear pierced my chest. I grabbed my husband's arm, my fingers digging into his jacket. "What is that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He shone his flashlight in the direction of the eyes. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the creature for a split second. A flash of fur, a glint of teeth. But before we could get a good look, it was gone, melting back into the fog. My heart pounded against my ribs, and my mouth went dry. The woods were silent, so silent that I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. "Probably just a deer or something," my husband said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We stood there, straining to listen, when suddenly more eyes appeared. 3, 4, 5 sets, glowing in the darkness. They flickered to life one by one, forming a semicircle around us. My heart felt like it was about to burst out of my chest, and a primal instinct screamed at me to run. But my feet wouldn't move. The eyes stayed low to the ground, silent and unmoving, watching us with an unsettling patience. The fog thickened even more, swirling around our ankles like living mist, coiling and uncoiling. "Okay, time to go," my husband said, his voice strained. We turned to leave, but the path behind us had almost disappeared into the fog, and for a horrifying second, I thought we were lost, trapped in some ghostly labyrinth. The eyes seemed to follow us as we stumbled backward, and every shadow in the woods suddenly felt like it was reaching for us, like the trees were leaning in closer, listening. "Run," I whispered, and then we were sprinting, our footsteps thundering in the eerie silence. I could feel my legs shaking beneath me, and the mist made every step treacherous, but fear propelled me forward. Branches scratched at my face, and I nearly twisted my ankle on a root, but I didn't dare slow down. I was sure that if I looked back, I'd see those glowing eyes right behind me closing in. We finally burst through the fog and into the clearing of our campsite, gasping for breath, hearts hammering. My hands were trembling so violently that I had to clutch them to my chest, trying to calm down. The fear still pulsed through my veins, a raw, electric terror that refused to fade. Only then did we hear them, small, rustling movements at the edge of the campsite. Our flashlight beams darted over the underbrush, and out of the shadows came the culprits, foxes. Dozens of them, their eyes glinting in the flashlight's glow. They watched us with a curious wariness, some tilting their heads as if wondering why we'd disturbed their nightly patrol. My knees buckled, and I let out a half-hysterical laugh, relief flooding through me. The tension in my chest slowly unwound, but the memory of those eyes in the fog, so eerily still and watchful, lingered long after the foxes had wandered off. Even though we knew the source, Rock Island felt different, as if we'd glimpsed some secret that it preferred to keep hidden, something ancient and waiting just beyond the mist. For the rest of the night, every rustle of leaves and whisper of wind felt like a warning, and I couldn't shake the feeling that, foxes or not, something else on that island had been watching us too. A few years ago, my wife and I ventured deep into the backcountry of Glacier National Park, carrying only the essentials on our backs. We were 12 miles into the wilderness, far from any hint of civilization. There was no cell signal out here, just endless trails winding through wild, untamed landscapes. It was the kind of place that made you feel both awed and small, a patch of raw nature where every sound carried an edge of something ancient and unknown. The rules in Glacier's backcountry are strict. You camp exactly where your permit says, no deviations. So when we reached our designated tent site after a grueling day's hike, we found ourselves in a wide, open expanse. Bushes and rocks dotted the area, with sparse, skeletal dead trees scattered across the land like the bleached bones of fallen giants. But it was the two tall, dead trees directly beside our tent site that immediately caught my attention. They loomed over us, stripped bare, their cracked and decaying trunks towering like sinister sentinels. I felt a cold prickle of unease, but what could we do? We had no choice but to set up camp and hope for the best. The sun dipped below the jagged peaks, casting long shadows that crept across the landscape until darkness swallowed everything. Stars blanketed the sky, a stunning, glittering tapestry, and for a while, we forgot about the dead trees. We sat outside the tent, soaking in the quiet beauty, the only sounds the rustle of the wind and the occasional distant call of an unseen creature. It felt wild, untamed, but peaceful. Then came the storm. It started with a low rumble, a deep, rolling growl that echoed off the mountains. I jolted awake at the sound, heart thumping. The wind picked up, sweeping through our campsite with a feral energy, and the rain followed soon after, pelting our tent in an angry, staccato rhythm. My wife stirred beside me, groggy but alert, her eyes wide in the sudden darkness. There was no time to exchange more than a nervous glance before the sky split open. A flash of lightning lit up the world, blinding and stark. For a single frozen moment, I could see everything in harsh detail. The skeletal trees swaying wildly in the wind, the landscape washed in white, and the fear etched on my wife's face. Then darkness crashed down again, even heavier than before, followed by a crack of thunder so loud it felt like the sky had shattered. The earth seemed to vibrate with its force, and I felt the sound deep in my bones. My breath came in shallow gasps, my pulse racing. The tent flapped and strained against the wind, the thin fabric our only shield against the raging storm. Rainwater seeped in from the edges, soaking our sleeping bags. Each time the lightning flared, I found myself staring at those towering dead trees, the storm whipping their skeletal branches back and forth like the arms of furious specters. The trees groaned under the onslaught, the sound like the wailing of some ancient, tortured spirit. I clung to my wife, the air between us thick with terror. The thought repeated in my mind like a drumbeat, they're going to fall. The dead trees loomed over us, threatening to come crashing down at any moment, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The storm had us trapped. Then the wind screamed, a banshee howl that ripped through the campsite. Another lightning strike illuminated the nightmare landscape, and this time I saw it. One of the dead trees beginning to tilt. My stomach lurched, and I heard myself gasp. The tree shuddered, groaning in a way that made the hair on my neck stand up. The wind roared again, and I realized with sickening certainty that it was happening. The tree was coming down. "Move!" I screamed, grabbing my wife and scrambling to get out of the tent. We tore through the zipper, tripping over each other in our frantic rush to escape. The world around us exploded in chaos, the wind tearing at our clothes, the rain blinding us. We stumbled into the storm, hearts racing, feet slipping on the slick, muddy ground. And then it happened. The dead tree let out one final, awful groan, and with a cracking, splintering roar, it gave way. The sound was deafening, a wooden scream that shattered the night. We dove blindly to the side, hitting the ground hard, mud splattering across our faces. I twisted around just in time to see the tree crash down, the impact reverberating through the earth. It struck mere feet from our tent, splintering into jagged shards. The ground shook, and my ears rang with the noise, my mind blank with shock. For several heartbeats, we lay there, soaking wet and trembling, our limbs tangled together. The storm didn't care. It raged on, thunder cracking and lightning blazing, but the fallen tree lay still, a broken colossus defeated at last. My wife was gripping my arm so tightly it hurt, but I welcomed the pain. It meant we were still here, still alive. "Are you okay?" I yelled over the storm, my voice hoarse. She nodded, eyes wide and wild, her hair plastered to her face by the rain. We clung to each other, hearts pounding, and for the rest of that long, terrifying storm, we sat there in the mud, wide awake and hyper-alert, waiting for the next threat. We were two tiny figures in the vast, merciless wilderness, helpless against nature's fury, and every flash of lightning sent a fresh jolt of fear through me. We were alive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, that the storm had nearly claimed us, and was waiting for another chance. When the storm finally passed and dawn broke over Glacier National Park, the wreckage became clearer. The tree lay splintered beside our mangled tent, a grim reminder of how close we had come to disaster. But we had survived, and yet I still felt the wilderness pressing in around us, vast and indifferent, a wild, ancient force that had almost swallowed us whole. The night was thick with shadows, an almost palpable darkness pressing in around me. I was deep, deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest hint of civilization. I'd camped in these woods countless times over the past 30 years. I knew their rhythms, the sounds they made, the way the wind whispered through the pines, and how the owls called to each other in the dead of night. It had always been a place of comfort, of familiarity. But that night, everything felt different. The fire crackled softly, the last embers glowing in the darkness. My tent was set up just a few feet away, and I sat beside the dying flames, staring into the black woods. The forest was strangely quiet, a deep, unsettling stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. Normally, the night would be full of sounds. Frogs calling from the nearby creek, the rustle of leaves as small creatures moved through the underbrush, coyotes yipping in the distance. But tonight there was nothing. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe the air pressure had changed, or maybe a predator was nearby, and that was why everything had gone silent. But even those thoughts didn't comfort me. There was something oppressive about the stillness, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something I couldn't see. Then I heard it, a sound that shattered the quiet like glass, echoing off the trees and rolling through the darkness. It was a howl, or maybe a call, but it was nothing I'd ever heard before. It started low, a deep, resonant note that sent a cold shiver down my spine, then rose into a keening wail that echoed through the woods. It was mournful and wild, filled with a kind of ancient sorrow that made my heart clench in my chest. I've camped in these woods for 3 decades. I know the calls of every native animal, from the deep bellow of a bull elk to the yipping cries of foxes. But this was different. This was something other. It was the kind of sound that seemed to bypass reason and understanding, and went straight to your most primal fears. Every instinct I had screamed that something was very, very wrong. My pulse thundered in my ears, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I sat frozen, ears straining, my eyes trying to pierce the darkness beyond the firelight. And then it happened again, a second call, this time from the opposite direction. It was almost identical to the first, but somehow more aggressive, more urgent. It echoed through the woods, and I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. Whatever these creatures were, they were communicating, calling to each other, and I was in the middle of it. I forced myself to breathe, trying to slow the frantic pounding of my heart. I reached for my flashlight, hands trembling, and swept the beam into the forest. The light barely made a dent in the suffocating darkness. It illuminated only gnarled trunks and tangled underbrush, casting long, flickering shadows that danced and shifted as the wind stirred the trees. The forest felt alive, the shadows pulsing, and I suddenly felt horribly small and vulnerable. Another call rang out, this time closer. It was deep, guttural, resonating in a way that I felt in my bones. The fire flickered as a gust of wind passed through, and I could have sworn I heard something moving, heavy footfalls crunching through the undergrowth. My breath came in shallow, terrified gasps. I was a seasoned camper, experienced in the ways of the wilderness, but I had never felt fear like this. My mind raced. What could it be? Bears didn't sound like that. Wolves, maybe? But no, wolves' howls didn't echo with that strange, inhuman quality. The sound was too big, too powerful. And the way the calls seemed to answer each other, coming from all around, made me feel trapped, surrounded. I had never believed in the stories people told about these woods. The whispered legends of things that weren't quite animals, things that moved in the darkness and watched from the shadows. I had laughed them off as campfire tales, things to scare city folk who didn't know better. But now, sitting there in the dark with those calls echoing through the trees, I felt a chill in my bones that no amount of logic could shake. I believed now. The calls came again, even closer, and I jumped to my feet, grabbing a heavy branch from the fire pit like a makeshift weapon. My flashlight beam wavered as I turned, heart slamming in my chest. The firelight cast strange, shifting shadows, and I thought I saw something move, something tall and impossibly broad, slipping between the trees. I couldn't be sure. My vision blurred with panic, and my mouth went dry. I backed toward my tent, every muscle in my body tense, listening for more sounds. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering secrets I couldn't understand. I heard more rustling, more heavy footsteps, and the feeling of being watched became almost unbearable. My mind conjured images of massive, shaggy creatures, eyes glinting in the darkness, creatures that had lived in these woods long before humans ever set foot here. Then, the final call echoed through the night, a booming, resonant sound so close it felt like the ground itself vibrated. My body moved before I could think, adrenaline kicking me into action. I dived into the tent, zipping it up as though a thin layer of nylon could protect me from whatever was out there. I clutched my flashlight and sat in the dark, my wife's sleeping bag empty beside me. She had stayed home this time, and I felt a sudden, desperate need for her presence, for anything familiar. I sat there, paralyzed, the sounds of the forest creeping into the silence. Hours passed, the calls fading, but the fear didn't. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting in the pitch-black tent, heart racing, ears straining for every rustle, every snap of a twig. I waited for the dawn, for the safety of daylight, all the while believing, truly, deeply believing, that something ancient and wild had been watching me. Something that wasn't supposed to exist, but did. When morning finally broke, pale light filtering through the trees, I emerged from the tent, exhausted and shaken. The forest looked different, innocent, as if the horrors of the night had never happened. But I knew better. The memory of those calls still echoed in my mind, and as I packed up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting for the next night to fall. Before I got married, before I had kids and responsibilities that anchored me to the world, I used to spend countless summers exploring the most remote corners of the wilderness. Solo backpacking and fly fishing trips were my escape, a way to feel connected to something wild and untouched. The Trinity Alps in Northern California were one of my favorite destinations, stark, beautiful, and impossibly vast. On one of those trips, I hiked 15 or 20 miles deep into the range, far beyond the last hint of civilization. Just me, my gear, and miles of uncharted wilderness. It was the third night of my trip, and I had found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small meadow opened up beneath the jagged peaks, carpeted in wildflowers and surrounded by the deep green of pine forests. A crystal-clear creek snaked its way through the clearing, full of fat trout that practically leapt onto my line. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink as I cooked my catch over a small fire, feeling the kind of contentment that only comes from being completely, blissfully alone. By the time I crawled into my tent, the world had darkened into a tapestry of stars. The fire had died down to embers, and the forest seemed to settle, wrapping itself around me like a heavy, living blanket. It was the kind of silence you only find deep in the wild, a silence so profound it almost felt sacred. Exhausted from the day's hike, I fell asleep quickly, the rhythmic sounds of the creek lulling me into dreams. But then I woke up. Something was wrong. I lay there in the pitch darkness, heart thudding as I tried to pinpoint what had pulled me from sleep. The silence I had once found comforting now felt oppressive, pressing in around me. I strained to listen, every muscle tense, waiting for any sign of what had disturbed me. And then I heard it, a light tap against the side of my tent. My breath caught. The sound was faint, almost innocuous, but unmistakable. A pebble? A pine cone? I waited, body stiff and ears straining. The seconds ticked by in agonizing slowness, and then tap, there it was again. Something was lightly striking the side of my tent, coming in bursts every 2 to 5 minutes. I lay there, wide-eyed, clutching my sleeping bag, the darkness pressing against me. I tried to convince myself it was just something natural, a stray breeze dislodging debris, a small animal skittering too close. But there was no wind. The air felt unnaturally still, the kind of stillness that only happens when a storm is about to break, or when something is waiting. And I couldn't hear or smell any signs of wildlife. The forest around me was dead silent, as if every creature had gone into hiding. The tapping went on, erratic and unsettling, for what felt like an eternity. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. Was it a person? Another camper? But who would be out here, this far into the wilderness, in the dead of night? My stomach twisted at the thought of being watched, of unseen eyes lurking just beyond the thin walls of my tent. Eventually, the fear gave way to another uncomfortable reality. I desperately needed to pee. My bladder felt like it was about to burst, and I knew I had two choices: either go right there in my tent or face whatever was outside. The idea of stepping into the dark unknown made my skin crawl, but I couldn't wait any longer. I tried to steel myself, my hands trembling as I reached for the zipper. As I did, I found myself whispering into the darkness, my voice thin and shaky. "I'll leave first thing in the morning," I said, as if that could appease whatever was out there. "I promise." The tapping stopped. Just like that, the forest fell back into that eerie, suffocating silence. My heart raced, and I waited, every nerve on edge, but there was nothing. No more taps. No movement. Just that oppressive stillness. Gathering every ounce of courage I had, I slowly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold, dark meadow. The moon hung low in the sky, casting pale light across the clearing. My breath came out in shaky clouds, and I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see something, someone watching me. But there was only darkness. The forest loomed, silent and impenetrable, and I hurried to take care of my business, every shadow making my skin prickle. I didn't linger. I crawled back into my tent and spent the rest of the night sitting up, my headlamp clutched in my hands, flinching at every whisper of sound. When dawn finally broke, I felt a surge of relief so powerful it nearly brought me to tears. The sunlight bathed the meadow in gold, chasing away the shadows that had felt so menacing. I packed up my camp quickly, every rustle of grass making my heart jump. As I gathered my gear, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Scattered around my tent were 30 or 40 small stones and pine cones, clustered together as if deliberately placed. My heart thumped painfully in my chest, and I glanced up at the clear sky. There had been no trees above my tent, nothing that could have dropped them naturally. It was as if someone or something had been throwing them at me, trying to get my attention. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and left the meadow, moving quickly and never once looking back. The forest felt different as I made my way out, the trees watching me with an unsettling stillness, the silence heavy and knowing. I don't know what was out there that night, but something had been. Something had watched me, tested me, and I had no desire to ever encounter it again. To this day, I don't have an explanation for what happened. But when people talk about the things that live deep in the wild, things we can't quite understand, I don't laugh anymore. Because now I believe. There's something timeless and eerie about old summer camps, the kind where history lingers like an echo. The camp where I worked as a counselor was one of those places. Founded in the 1920s, it was full of forgotten paths and abandoned cabins swallowed by decades of wild growth. Every summer, me and a group of fellow counselors would find ourselves drawn to the mysteries of the forest, eager to explore trails that hadn't seen footprints in decades. Our walks were usually full of laughter and curiosity, a chance to tell ghost stories and try to spook each other. But one night, late in July, something changed. The sky was clear, the stars bright overhead, and the forest felt different. Heavier, as if the trees were holding their breath, listening. We followed a narrow, winding path that we hadn't taken in a long time, our flashlights casting thin beams of light onto the undergrowth. The air was thick with the scent of pine and earth, and our footsteps felt too loud, crunching over leaves and twigs. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual night sounds, the croak of frogs, the hum of insects, seemed to vanish, swallowed by the shadows. That was when we stumbled onto it, an opening in the woods, a small, perfectly circular field bathed in moonlight. We hadn't seen it before, and I could tell by the uneasy looks on my friends' faces that they were just as confused as I was. It wasn't on any of the camp maps, and we couldn't recall ever hearing about it. But the most unsettling thing was what sat in the center of that clearing. A small, child-sized tea party table stood there, pristine but out of place, like something pulled from a long-forgotten memory. It had that unmistakable pastel-painted finish, chipped in places, the kind of table little girls use to pretend they're hosting a tea party. For small chairs surrounded it, all of them neatly pushed in, as though the guests had been polite enough to tidy up before they left. The whole setup was bizarrely out of place, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were intruding on something that wasn't meant for us to see. It was the leaves, though, that made my skin crawl. The entire table was covered in a thick layer of dead leaves, and that alone wouldn't have been so strange, except there weren't any trees overhead. The field was bare, wide open to the sky. The leaves looked as if they had been deliberately gathered, almost like someone had tried to cover the table, hide it from sight. We stood there, frozen and confused, exchanging glances that were a mix of disbelief and unease. "Who would bring this out here?" one of my friends whispered, her voice barely carrying in the eerie quiet. No one had an answer. The camp was old, sure, but this felt wrong, like a relic of a past that had no business lingering in the present. Another counselor, trying to break the tension, suggested it was some old prop left over from a camp game decades ago, maybe something the kids played with when the camp was new. But even as he said it, his voice wavered, and I could see the fear in his eyes. We all could feel it, that sense of being watched, of having stumbled into a place where something else was waiting. We left the clearing quickly, our laughter forced and nervous, and we didn't talk much as we made our way back to the camp. I couldn't shake the feeling of those little chairs, perfectly arranged around the table, as though something unseen had been playing a game in that clearing long before we arrived. A few weeks passed, and summer rolled on, the incident fading to the back of our minds. But the forest seemed to hold a new, watchful silence whenever we passed near that area. Finally, our curiosity got the better of us, and one late afternoon, while the sun was still high enough to cut through the shadows, we decided to go back. The air felt wrong as we made our way down the path, a cold shiver brushing against my skin even in the warmth of the sun. When we stepped into the clearing, my heart dropped into my stomach. The chairs were gone, all 4 of them. The table, however, remained, now completely free of leaves. It was pristine, gleaming in the afternoon light, as though someone had taken the time to carefully clean it. The surface had been brushed off, almost lovingly, revealing more of that chipped pastel paint. A cold dread settled over me. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, something, watching from the shadows. The forest stood still, silent and breathless, and I couldn't get the image out of my head. Small hands wiping away the leaves, setting everything just so, waiting for us to return. We didn't linger. This time, there was no nervous laughter, no joking explanations. We turned and left as quickly as we could, a heavy, uncomfortable silence hanging between us. None of us wanted to say it out loud, but we all knew. There was something wrong with that clearing, something ancient and patient, and perhaps not quite finished with us. We never went back. The rest of the summer, we avoided that part of the woods, sticking to the familiar trails. We were deep in the mountains, camping as a whole family, like we did every summer. These trips were a tradition, something that brought us together, away from the noise of everyday life and into the heart of the wild. The spot we picked that year was particularly remote, nestled at the base of towering pines and surrounded by rugged, untouched wilderness. The nearest town was over an hour away, and the winding dirt road that brought us there was so rough and narrow that it was easy to believe we were the only people in the world. The campfire burned brightly, casting dancing shadows into the trees, and we all laughed and shared stories. My younger brother and our cousin, both in their late teens, were feeling adventurous that night. They decided they wanted to pitch their tent far away from the rest of us, eager to prove how brave they were. With flashlights in hand and their tent slung over their shoulders, they headed off into the woods, promising to set up camp somewhere farther down the trail. We all watched them disappear into the darkness, teasing them about how they'd come running back to camp if they heard so much as a twig snap. Hours passed. The fire died down to embers, and the forest settled into a thick, heavy silence. One by one, we all retired to our tents, the stillness of the mountains wrapping around us like a heavy blanket. The air was cool, and the only sound was the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Sleep came easily, but sometime in the middle of the night, something shattered that peace. My brother and cousin later told us how it started. They had fallen asleep in their tent, joking around and feeling confident after a day of hiking and exploring. The mountain air had lulled them into a deep sleep. But then they woke up. My brother couldn't say exactly what had stirred him from sleep at first, but he felt an icy prickle on the back of his neck, the kind of feeling you get when you realize you're not alone. He lay there, holding his breath, the thin walls of the tent amplifying every sound from outside. The forest was quiet, unnervingly so. He thought it must have been a dream or his imagination playing tricks on him. But then he heard it, a low, muffled chuckle drifting through the trees. His blood ran cold. He turned to our cousin, eyes wide, and whispered, "Did you hear that?" Our cousin had been awake too, lying perfectly still. His voice was tight with fear. "Yeah." Then, clear and unmistakable, the laughter came again. It was the laughter of a grown man, deep and throaty, but something about it was off. It was hollow, devoid of warmth or humor, a sound that carried an edge of madness. The man was standing just across the narrow dirt trail from where they had pitched their tent, only a few feet away. They couldn't see him through the fabric, but the way his voice carried told them he was close, far too close. The laughter continued, echoing through the woods, a slow, unsettling chuckle that turned their blood to ice. It sounded like whoever was out there was thoroughly amused, as though he were in on some sick joke that only he understood. They were paralyzed with fear, too afraid to unzip the tent and look, too afraid to even breathe too loudly. The darkness outside felt suffocating, pressing in from all sides. They knew there shouldn't be anyone out there. We were miles from the nearest road, with no other campers for miles. There weren't even cabins or houses nearby. Just wild, empty forest. My brother gripped the camping knife he had brought, his hands slick with sweat. They lay there in the dark, heartbeats thundering in their ears, every nerve in their bodies screaming to run. But where could they run? The man was standing right there, just a few feet away, laughing as if he had all the time in the world. They had never felt so helpless. The laughter went on for what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, and then it stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse, the absence of that eerie chuckle amplifying every creak and rustle around them. They waited, breathless, straining to hear anything, the crunch of footsteps, a whispered word, anything that would tell them where the man had gone. But there was only silence, thick and oppressive. The boys didn't dare move. They lay there, muscles aching from tension, their fear so potent it made their stomachs churn. The hours crawled by, and every time the wind rustled the leaves or a twig snapped in the distance, they braced themselves for the sound of footsteps approaching the tent. But nothing came. The man, whoever or whatever, he was never returned. At the first light of dawn, they finally worked up the courage to leave the tent. Shaking and exhausted, they unzipped the flap and stepped into the pale, golden light of morning. The forest was serene, almost mocking in how peaceful it appeared. There were no signs of anyone having been there. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing. Just the memory of that awful laughter hanging in the air, as fresh and vivid as it had been in the dead of night. They sprinted back to the main camp, faces pale and eyes wide. When they told us what had happened, we all fell silent. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, someone from a nearby trail who had wandered too far. But deep down, we knew there was no logical explanation. We had been alone out there, truly alone. That night changed something for all of us. The forest, once a place of adventure and wonder, now held shadows we couldn't explain. We never camped that far out again, and the memory of that laughter still lingers. Even now, years later, when the wind howls through the trees, I sometimes imagine I hear it, faint and mocking, somewhere deep in the woods, waiting for the next unsuspecting campers to stumble too far into its domain. Working at a summer camp in North Georgia, nestled right at the foot of the Appalachian Trail near Dahlonega, had always felt like stepping into a different world. The mountains stretched out endlessly, draped in thick forests that pulsed with the energy of the wild. The air was fresh, tinged with the scent of pine and damp earth, and at night, the sky exploded into a canvas of stars. There was something enchanting about that place, something both beautiful and daunting. But those woods held secrets, old, dark ones that still make my heart race when I think about them. The camp where I worked took kids out on the Appalachian Trail, guiding them through the rugged, wild terrain. We taught them about nature, survival skills, and the art of simply being present in the vast wilderness. Most nights, we'd set up A-frame tents to sleep in, but on warm, clear nights, we'd opt for cowboy camping. We'd spread a giant tarp across the forest floor, throw down our sleeping bags, and sleep under the open sky, with nothing between us and the stars but the whispering trees. It was one of those perfect, balmy summer nights about 15 years ago when a group of counselors, mostly college kids, had gathered for a well-earned rest. The forest felt serene, humming with the gentle chorus of crickets and the occasional rustle of nocturnal creatures in the underbrush. The camp was quiet, and the counselors were stretched out on the tarp, some already drifting off to sleep, others whispering quietly about the day's adventures. One of the counselors, a college girl named Emily, lay closest to the edge of the tarp, her long brown hair spread out over her sleeping bag. She had always loved the thrill of sleeping out in the open, feeling as though the universe was right there, breathing with her. She fell asleep that night with a contented smile, the kind of peace that only the wilderness could bring. But that peace didn't last. When the first blush of dawn began to creep over the horizon, the world still hushed and blue, Emily awoke. The birds hadn't started their morning chorus yet, and the air was crisp with that pre-dawn chill. She yawned, rubbing the sleep from her eyes, and rolled over, reaching to sit up. That's when she saw it. A knife was sticking out of the ground, embedded so deeply that the hilt barely wobbled. It was less than an inch from her face, the cold steel glinting in the early morning light. Her heart stuttered, confusion quickly giving way to terror. Her breath caught in her throat, and for a moment she was paralyzed, every nerve in her body screaming at her that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Her shaking hands reached out to the knife, her fingers brushing against a small piece of paper attached to the hilt. The note was crumpled, but the writing on it was clear, the letters scrawled in a harsh, almost taunting hand. "We could have killed you last night. Zoxo, the Army Rangers." Emily's blood ran cold. The note felt like a physical blow, a gut-wrenching realization that someone, or something, had been there while they all slept, creeping through their campsite under the cover of darkness. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of it. They were miles from any roads, deep in the wilderness. There shouldn't have been anyone out there, no hikers, no strangers. But whoever had done this had been close enough to reach her, to plant a knife inches from her face without making a sound. Panic spread like wildfire. Emily's gasp woke the other counselors, and as they groggily sat up, the horror in her eyes told them everything they needed to know. They crowded around her, reading the note, and a collective fear settled over the group like a suffocating blanket. The forest, once familiar and welcoming, now felt predatory, the trees closing in around them. The Army Rangers trained in these mountains, and everyone knew that. There were stories about their stealth, their ability to move through the woods like shadows. But those were just stories, right? Tales meant to scare campers and make people feel uneasy. Yet here was proof, thrust into the soft earth, taunting them, mocking their vulnerability. "What kind of sick joke is this?" one of the counselors muttered, his voice thin and strained. But no one laughed. The implications were too chilling. They packed up in silence, the dawn light creeping slowly through the trees, offering little comfort. Every sound, every snapping twig and rustling leaf, set their nerves on edge. They hiked back to the main camp in a tight, tense group, constantly looking over their shoulders. The forest felt alive with secrets, the shadows hiding things that watched and waited. The camp director called the local authorities, but there wasn't much they could do. The Rangers operated with a level of authority and secrecy that made complaints difficult to investigate. It was probably just a prank, someone tried to suggest, but the idea did little to soothe their unease. A prank was supposed to be funny. This was a threat, a clear message that they were at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. Emily never cowboy camped again. She stuck to the safety of tents, but even then, sleep never came easily. The wilderness, once a source of wonder, had become something darker, something that could reach out with unseen hands in the dead of night. Even now, years later, the memory lingers, the glint of the knife, the twisted humor of that note, and the unshakable feeling that some threats are always lurking, just waiting for the right moment to make themselves known. Because in the mountains, no matter how deep you go or how much you think you know the wilderness, there are things and people that remain hidden. Things that watch, that move in silence, and that sometimes remind you just how vulnerable you truly are. We were camping in the heart of the wilderness, right beside a glacier perched at the top of a mountain, miles away from civilization. It was summer, but up there, summer was a loose term. The air was crisp, biting cold as it rolled off the icy blue face of the glacier. The wall of ice loomed over us, vast and ancient, glinting under the sunlight in shades of pale blue and ghostly white. The glacier seemed alive, groaning and creaking as it shifted, a sound that echoed off the mountain slopes like whispers from some colossal, slumbering creature. To shield ourselves from the frigid wind that gusted down from the ice, we'd built a low stone wall around our tent. We spent the first day marveling at the raw beauty around us. The sky was impossibly blue, and the air was so pure it felt otherworldly. In the distance, we watched two mountaineers make their way up the glacier, tiny black specks clinging to the ice, the ropes between them like thin spiderwebs against the vast, glistening wall. We could hear the occasional thud of their axes as they hacked into the frozen surface. Everything felt sharp, vivid, and exhilarating, but nature has a way of reminding you just how small and fragile you really are. The next afternoon, the weather had warmed slightly, and the glacier had begun to groan more frequently. We decided to take a short hike to a waterfall nearby, leaving our camp behind. The sun was bright, and the sound of rushing water felt almost comforting, a reminder that life persisted even in the coldest corners of the world. We lingered there, soaking in the scenery, snapping photos, laughing, and talking about the adventures we still had ahead of us. When we finally turned to make our way back, the first thing that struck me was the silence. The air felt tense, heavy, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. We hurried back along the trail, our excitement fading to unease, and as we rounded the last bend, my stomach dropped. Our campsite was gone. Where our tent had stood, there was now a mangled mess of shattered stone and twisted fabric. Rocks and debris littered the area, a chaotic landscape of destruction. It looked as if some enormous hand had swept down the mountain and flattened everything in its path. My knees felt weak, and for a moment, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My brain struggled to process the sheer scale of the devastation. A huge chunk of ice had broken off the glacier, tearing away from the wall and crashing down the slope. It must have brought half the mountain with it, a merciless avalanche of rock and ice that had obliterated everything in its path. The force had been so immense that boulders the size of cars lay scattered like pebbles. Our tent was unrecognizable, crushed and buried beneath the debris. My heart thudded painfully in my chest as I took it all in, my breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts. We exchanged a look, my friend and I, our faces pale. We didn't need to say it out loud to understand. If we had been at the camp when it happened, we'd be dead. There would have been no chance, no time to escape. That stone wall we'd built wouldn't have stopped anything. It had all come down in a storm of ice and rock, a brutal, unstoppable force of nature. I felt sick. My hands were shaking, and a wave of cold dread washed over me. The mountain, the glacier, it all felt different now. The raw beauty had become something monstrous, something that had nearly claimed us without warning. We were lucky. Stupidly, unbelievably lucky. But that realization made it all the more terrifying. We were completely at the mercy of this wild, ancient place, and it had almost swallowed us whole. The glacier groaned again, a low, mournful sound that made the hair on my neck stand on end. It was as if the mountain itself was mocking us, reminding us that we were intruders here, that we didn't belong. The air grew colder, the wind biting at my exposed skin, and for the first time, the isolation of the place felt suffocating instead of exhilarating. We were hours away from any help, surrounded by sheer cliffs and the ever-present threat of the glacier above. We worked in stunned silence, salvaging what little we could from the wreckage. Our gear was ruined, scattered and broken, but we managed to find our emergency supplies. The sense of vulnerability was crushing. Every shadow seemed deeper, every creak and groan of the ice more sinister. The mountain loomed over us, and I felt like a small, insignificant thing in the face of its power, like a toy that could be crushed at any moment. We packed up quickly, our movements mechanical, driven by the adrenaline and terror still coursing through our veins. The weight of what had happened sat heavily on our shoulders, and I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The image of that shattered campsite, the thought of us lying there, buried under tons of ice and rock. As we made our way down the mountain, every step was haunted by the knowledge that we had been inches from death. The glacier continued to groan, a reminder that this place wasn't ours, that it owed us nothing. And as we descended, leaving the shattered remains of our camp behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped something ancient and merciless, a force that would remain long after we were gone. The mountain had shown us a glimpse of its power, and I would never forget that icy, yawning sense of vulnerability, the realization that nature isn't just beautiful, it's fierce, unyielding, and utterly indifferent. It happened about 7 years ago, during my final summer as a camper at an overnight camp in New England. I remember the air had that crisp, pine-scented bite that makes you feel alive, the woods both inviting and foreboding under the late summer sky. Every camper looked forward to their overnight adventure. It was a rite of passage, a trek out to a remote spot about 2.5 miles from camp at the top of this massive rocky hill. The hill was bare at the summit, a smooth expanse of weathered stone surrounded by a dense, shadowy forest. The kind of place that felt wild and ancient, where the dark seemed to breathe around you. The session had been buzzing with a nervous energy, mostly fueled by us kids freaking each other out with horror stories about townies. The camp owned all the land surrounding the lake, a wild stretch of wilderness, but we knew that just beyond the far side of the hill, there was a small, tight-knit community. Townies, we called them. We'd never seen them, but we'd spun countless tales about these shadowy figures lurking in the woods, waiting for the right moment to come crashing through the trees and attack us. We didn't really believe it, not during the day anyway, but as the sun set and shadows stretched long over the hilltop, those stories started to feel more real. That night, as we lay in our sleeping bags under the stars, the wind picked up. It whispered through the trees, rustling leaves that sounded like footsteps just out of sight. The campfire had burned low, and the night pressed in around us, heavy and thick. That's when whispers started to ripple through the group. A few kids swore they'd heard something, a muffled voice, the snap of a branch, the unmistakable sound of someone out there in the woods. The stories of townies, half forgotten in the daylight, rushed back in vivid, terrifying detail. The counselors tried to calm us down, insisting it was just our imaginations. But a couple of us could see the tension in their faces, the way they glanced over their shoulders. 2 counselors volunteered to check it out, more to settle our nerves than anything else. Joe, who stood 6 feet 3 inches and built like a wall of muscle, and Thomas, a lean but capable guy, grabbed flashlights and disappeared into the woods. We fell into a nervous hush, ears straining to catch any sound over the pounding of our own hearts. We sat there, breath held, the minutes stretching long. Then, from somewhere in the woods, we heard Joe's voice. It wasn't quite yelling, but it was loud and forceful, cutting through the darkness. "You guys cannot be here," he bellowed, his voice taut with authority. "This is private property. We have a walkie-talkie, and will call the police if you do not leave." A chill shot through me, and I wasn't the only one. Everyone froze, our bodies rigid with fear. The whispers among us ceased, replaced by a heavy, electrified silence. The idea that someone was out there, watching us from the shadows, became horrifyingly real. And then, a loud, sickening bang echoed through the trees, followed by a blood-curdling scream. It was a raw, guttural sound, full of agony and panic. I felt my stomach twist into knots, the cold shock of fear paralyzing me. Kids were starting to cry, wide-eyed and terrified, some clutching each other, others whispering prayers under their breath. Moments later, Joe burst out of the woods, his face wild with urgency. "Get the kids out of here now," he roared, pointing to the remaining counselors. Then he turned and sprinted back into the forest, vanishing into the dark. One of the other counselors, pale and visibly shaking, grabbed 2 of the camp's steak knives and ran after Joe and Thomas, leaving the rest of us with just 2 counselors to guide our terrified group down the rocky, treacherous hill. We scrambled to our feet, some of us still in our underwear, panic propelling us into action. The woods had never felt more hostile. Twigs snapped under our bare feet, and branches clawed at our skin as we stumbled and tripped, trying to escape whatever nightmare was unfolding behind us. The cold mountain air burned in my lungs, and every shadow seemed to lunge at us. Kids were sobbing, some clutching sticks as if they could use them for protection. My own hands were shaking so violently I could barely keep hold of my flashlight. "Keep moving," one of the counselors shouted, his voice cracking. We half ran, half slid down the hill, the darkness and the forest seeming to close in around us. My heart was a drumbeat of fear, and every sound, a rustling leaf, a distant creak, made me flinch. Then, just as we reached a clearing halfway down the hill, Joe, Thomas, and the other counselor came crashing out of the woods. They looked winded but unharmed, faces split into sheepish grins. My breath caught in my chest, and a wave of confusion swept through the group. What happened? One of the kids stammered, voice quivering. Joe couldn't hold it in any longer. He doubled over, laughing. We were messing with you, he choked out between gasps. The scream, the whole thing, it was a joke. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt sideways. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it made me dizzy, but it was quickly followed by a wave of anger. The counselors who hadn't been in on the joke looked equally stunned, one of them still clutching the knives with a white-knuckled grip. That night became camp legend, and the aftermath changed everything. The camp banned any pranks that involved scaring the kids, but the damage was done. I still remember that heart-stopping terror, the certainty that something, or someone was coming for us. Even now, the memory of that blood-curdling scream and the chaotic flight down the hill lingers, a ghost of fear that haunts me whenever I hear the whisper of wind through darkened woods.